to talk to you this morning about population collapse. And as if to prove the point, even this room is thinly populated at this early hour. It's a speed dating session. I'm going to speak for 15 minutes, and then Masood Ahmed is going to spend 4 minutes responding, and then there'll be time for questions. The history of human population is a remarkable history because for most of history, there really weren't very many of us. It took 123 years for the global population to double from 1 billion to 2 billion, then 33 years to go from 2 to 3 billion, 15 years from 3 to 4 billion, and we've been adding a billion roughly every 12 years since then. This is a population explosion that mostly happens in the 20th century, as this chart illustrates. But the question I want you to contemplate this morning is whether the trajectory of human history is about to change course drastically. This chart is one that caught my eye. It was published in the New York Times last year in an article by the demographer Dean Spears. And he argued, and I'll quote him, if the world's fertility rate were the same as in the United States today, then the global population would fall from a peak of around 10 billion to less than 2 billion about 300 years later. And you can see the scenarios playing out in the red projections. This, I think, is a future relatively few people have fully understood. Elon Musk has been right about quite a few things, from electric cars to reusable rockets. It's also been his preoccupation for at least 10 years. I remember discussing it with him 10 years ago, that population collapse due to low birth rates is a much bigger risk to civilization than global warming. Is he right? Well, demographers increasingly are accepting that the human population is likely to peak sooner than we previously thought. You can see in the different scenarios that the United Nations publishes that there's been a recent shift in terms of timing. The UN baseline projection now has global population peaking at 10.3 billion in the 2080s. But there are other scenarios in which it peaks sooner than that, conceivably in the 2060s. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation projects that it could decline beginning in 2064 down to something like 8.8 billion by 2100. And there are other estimates that I've put on the slide here that have the peak even sooner and the fall even faster. The reality is that many of the largest economies in the world, Japan, Italy, Russia, China, South Korea, Germany, Spain, already are experiencing population decline. And soon this peak will arrive in other major countries too. The key here is declining fertility rates. We can see that in multiple countries, we've fallen below the replacement rate, which is 2.11 births per woman. That replacement rate is an approximation. Every couple needs to have 2 children to replace themselves, plus a little additional child, as it were, to compensate for deaths in infancy. And you can see in the chart here that practically everywhere we look, the trend since the 1950s and 60s has been downwards, and in most developed countries it fell below the replacement rate some time ago. When you think about global aging, the graying of the human population, you're seeing 2 things at work. The extension of life expectancy due to improvements in medical science, but also the impact of declining fertility. These 2 things are interacting to make the human population much older than it's ever been historically, and you can see in the pyramid here what I'm talking about. What does this mean? Well, some of it's obvious, and you've almost certainly thought about it before. As the age structure changes, then working age populations shrink, and you can see in multiple countries on this slide here the changes that are happening and will happen. It also puts a strain on public finances. We've got old age dependency ratios shifting, and that, as you can see, is really quite dramatic in Japan. But Germany and Korea will be catching up with Japan in just 25 years' time. This also creates particular burdens on healthcare systems. The big increase in the number of individuals with dementia relative to the population as a whole is just one of the ways in which our changing age structure impacts public and private healthcare systems. Pension systems, which were mostly designed from the late 19th and early 20th century, when life expectancy was much shorter, have really not been updated to account for the fact that we're all living a lot longer and having many fewer children. What happens in public finance when you have these changing population structures is that increased expenditure on aging as well as on debt service, because countries with this kind of age structure end up running permanent deficits, crowd out spending in other areas, notably defense. So it's not surprising to find that an increasing number of countries in the world have governments trying to raise fertility. You can see here that compared with the 1970s, many, many more countries, and that's only 2015, it's even more today, have policies that are designed to incentivize couples to have more children. And the most interesting thing about this is trying to understand why we don't want to, why these policies almost everywhere fail. So the standard explanation for declining fertility rates is that as we got richer, we simply felt disinclined to have large families. So there's a simple correlation that you can show in a chart like this between total fertility rates and GDP per capita. You can see the same thing if you look at society in the way that this chart does, looking at richer families, which have over time tended to have smaller families, smaller numbers of children, than poorer families. That was a familiar pattern to 20th century sociologists. Oops, this is a very trigger-happy device I have in my hand here. The other critical shift that occurred in the later 20th century was that the entry of women into the labor force created a real opportunity cost to parenthood. As women, and some of them here, pursued careers, they had clear incentives to limit the number of children that they had, and advances in contraception made it much easier for women to control their fertility than had ever been true in history before. There we are. So female labor force participation and education levels have been the strong predictors of a country's total fertility rate. And this is true everywhere, regardless of, say, culture or history. What's interesting is, I mentioned culture, that the decline of religious faith seems to be a part of this story. And I'm an historian. Back in the 18th century, it was striking that French population growth began to slacken compared with English, and it's often been argued by historians that the French began to limit family size in the 18th century because they were experiencing the early onset of secularization. So the big question that we have to address is whether pronatal policies can raise the total fertility rate. Here are some examples of Chinese attempts to undo the impact of the one-child policy that, of course, was introduced at the time of Deng Xiaoping. And this is now a concerted effort by the Chinese Communist Party to undo the demographic impact that that policy had. The problem is that there's a powerful countervailing trend exemplified by the 4B movement in South Korea. The 4B movement refers to the principles of no sex with men, no giving birth, no dating men, and no marriage with men. This is a radical movement, but the fact that it even exists tells you something profoundly important about the way this species of ours is changing. Well, one obvious option which exists and is being explored in East Asia is to offset declines in the labor force with automation. And that's why it's in countries like South Korea as well as in China, you see really large-scale investment in robotics, significantly more than in Western countries. Western countries have tried to solve the problem through immigration. And this is why we've seen really big increases in the percentage of the population in countries from Australia to Switzerland, where we find ourselves, who are born abroad and migrate to a new country in their lifetimes. These foreign-born shares of the population are exceptionally high by historical standards. Because nearly all the increase in population between now and the end of the century will be in sub-Saharan Africa, that implies not only that the population of sub-Saharan Africa will increase as a share of total population, it also means that a rising share of migrants will almost certainly come from Africa. So by 2100, it won't just be that nearly 2/5 of the world population lives in Africa, a larger share will be of African descent because of migration patterns. This will mean continued, very rapid social and cultural change in the countries that go down the immigration route. You can see the dramatic decline that has already occurred in the white British and Irish share of London's population in our lifetimes. And that is a really striking chart, that already in 2021, less than 40% of the population of London was white British and Irish. You can also see here, Pew projects that by 2050, close to 12% of the British population will be Muslim. These are extraordinary changes happening in an amazingly compressed time period. The problem, and this is the last point that I want to make, is that these great shifts in migration are coinciding with a growing apart of the world's cultures. So if you look at the World Values Survey and look at relatively frequent instances of that survey, the striking thing to me is that on that cultural chart, Protestant Europe, or the English-speaking parts of the world, are in fact drawing away from other parts of the world, say the African Islamic part of the world that you see in the bottom left-hand part of the chart. Here's the most recent example from the World Values Survey of the Engelhardt-Welzel World Cultural Map. And to me, the really striking thing about this map is that it shows that when you plot traditional versus secular values on survival versus self-expression values, Protestant Europe, as well as parts of the English-speaking world, are really now much further away culturally than they were before from, say, the African Islamic, Latin American, or even the Orthodox European parts of the world. So a really important question that is perplexing politicians as well as voters in many of these countries is this: have parts of the Anglosphere and northwestern Europe become too progressive, easily to assimilate immigrants from other parts of the world? Whether or not population collapse is our future, we are already grappling with the political and cultural consequences of really large-scale migration, as well as with the fiscal and economic consequences of our aging populations. And as I said at the beginning, the aging population is a product not just of lengthening life expectancy, it is also a product of the dramatic collapse in fertility rates taking them below replacement in most, indeed all, developed countries and many less developed countries in the world. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to pause there, and it's going to be my great pleasure to invite my friend Masood Ahmed to stand up and offer some thoughts on what I've just said. Feel free to applaud.
Thank you very much, Niall. And I would just say that early morning, you get in Davos, people starting up, they've all had late nights, and you see Niall's slide. World goes up to 10 billion, then we all disappear, and you wake up. So great set of slides. Thank you for that. I'm going to make just 4 quick reactions to the points that Niall has set out. First, maybe in 300 years we'll disappear. Maybe we won't. It kind of depends on the problems of extrapolation, is that you extrapolate what you see. And it's very hard to predict whether when the world is back down to 3 billion, people won't change behavior. So behavioral change is very hard to incorporate into scenario. You can do scenarios, but the bottom line is there's clearly going to be a peaking of the world's population, and that's fairly clear. We will start declining. At some point, people may wake up to that fact and behaviors will start to change. Governments' attempts to change behaviors have been pretty hopeless. They haven't really achieved very much. We will see. Second point. We're all living much longer. Over the last 75 years, actually, we've added a whole extra life to most people. Life expectancy has doubled. This is great news. But since we are all living much longer, there's a set of things that come that need to be fixed with how do you manage so many more people who are living for an extra 20, 30, 40 years with the systems that weren't geared for that. The most obvious examples, pension schemes in many countries are struggling. Some are technically broke simply because we just didn't anticipate so many people would live for so much longer. Dementia is another example you gave, and Alzheimer. The diseases associated with age, how you make people who are older feel valuable in society, how do you give them a sense of contributing? These are also big issues. Some societies have gone further with it than others, but I think that's going to be a big challenge for us. Third, the fact is that, as you pointed out, young people, there are also fewer young people around, which changes the pyramid, but it also has its own consequences in terms of labor force ratio to the total population. And that's a big problem that everyone is going to face over the next 20, 30, 40 years. But, and this is my final point, the real issue we're going to face over the next 50 years is differential rates of aging and population decline across different parts of the world. And so you pointed out, African population is going up quite dramatically over the next 50 years. Young people will mostly be in Africa. 100 million young people come into the labor force every year in Africa. Europe has fewer and fewer young people coming into the labor force. Sure, we could try putting in robots to do some of those jobs. Sure, we could try to do technology. But at the end of the day, we are going to need young people in the labor force to do healthcare-related jobs, to do a lot of service jobs, which is very hard to get robots to do. And for that, we have to find a way to manage the flow of people across borders in ways that are not as socially disruptive as they have been in many cases now, because our societies have not been prepared to deal with that. And I think if there's one big challenge for governments over the next 50, 70 years, is how do we put in place a mechanism where societies, both those that are exporting and importing labor, can do so in a way that is not as disruptive, as tension creating, as divisive as it has been in the last 10 or 15 years, that you see it in many countries in Europe, the consequences. You see the consequences also increasingly in the United States, a country that was built on people coming in and contributing. So I think these are all really exciting points. And let me just end by saying, look, I think most people in government, out of government, don't like talking about these issues. Nobody wants to talk about migration. Nobody wants to talk about how to deal with aging societies. And we've got to the point where not talking about it is a bigger problem than the difficult conversations we're going to have if we're going to make progress on it. So let me stop with that. Thank you once again, Niall. I think now the two of us invite everyone else to participate.
Thank you very much indeed, Masood. The next stage in the operation is that you get to ask us questions. There's a microphone which will rove towards you. I suggest if you have a question, you raise a hand. There's one right there.
Thank you so. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing the insights. I'm Ayano Sasaki from the Davos 50 to represent the young boys from all over the world. And actually, I'm from Japan, and as a young woman from Japan, I feel a lot of pressure in these days living in Japanese societies because the government asks women to give birth more because, as you said, the fertility rate is very important. But if the young women do not want to have any kids because of their career or like lifestyles, I don't think that is not going to be the solution for us. In that case, we really need to start think about how to deal with just aging societies, not think about the fertility rates. But do you think that still Japanese governments need to work on like increasing the fertility rate even in that kind of circumstances? That is my question.
Well, thank you very much indeed for this question. As the father of a daughter now in her late 20s, I often think about the pressures on her to start a family and the tension between those pressures and her own feeling of economic insecurity. And I think this is a very common dilemma for young women all over the world. And if there was a longer version of this presentation with a slide about Japan's government policies, so we're well aware that Japan, as well as China, and not to mention South Korea, are trying to do something about this, and it isn't working. And it isn't working because women say to themselves, well, no, I don't actually want to have 2.1 or 3 or 4 children. I'm not even sure if I want to have one, or at least I want to postpone doing it. So as we, I think, both agree, this is a problem for governments. Nothing seems to work. And this goes back all the way to Mussolini in Italy in the 1920s and 30s with the battle for births, which, in effect, the fascist regime lost. So I don't think anybody's worked out a really effective way of persuading young women to have more children than they want to have. The one thing I would add is there's some evidence from the United States that women, and indeed men, have fewer children than they say they want to have. And so there does seem to be some disconnect between desire and outcome. This is partly, I think, because people postpone having children longer than they are wise to and then discover that they've left it too late. Do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you've said it, Niall. Look, the only thing I would just add to it is that the issue of preparing societies to deal with having a lot more older people and finding ways to integrate them in a productive sense of being valued is something you have to do whether or not you work on the fertility side. And there I do think that actually Japan in some ways has made more progress than others.
Let's take another question, if there is another question. Perhaps we've been so successful that we've answered all the questions in advance. I should say that if there are no other questions, it's a little awkward for two elderly men to talk about young women's decisions on fertility.
There's a
Thank
question
you.
there.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It was excellent. I agree with you that a lot of the problem with this issue is difficult conversations, talking about things that are difficult. And I just want to ask you something. Maybe it's the wrong thing to ask, but instead of constantly talking about the fact that we were climbing in population and now we're going down, oh no, what do we do? When will we get to the point where we're saying we're climbing in population, we've plateaued, and now we're going to have to do things differently? Shouldn't that also be part of the conversation? Instead of constantly trying to put these government incentives, asking women to have more babies, just kind of figuring out what the next step in our evolution is?
One of the interesting things about the history here is that the governments undoubtedly overreacted to population bomb projections. And this goes back to the 1960s and 70s debates, which I think produced some disastrous policy responses. The one-child policy in China is the best known, but actually the forced sterilization policies in India had terribly deleterious consequences. Matt Connolly has a terrific book on this whole subject. So I think this is an important thing to bear in mind. Governments overcorrected and overreacted to exaggerated fears about population bombs, and this had unintended consequences. We, as we think about the problems we face, must make sure we don't make a similar mistake. But I think the critical thing that I've been struck by in recent years is that our tendency to have a time horizon that stops in 2100 in our projections has led us to completely miss the dramatic decline that will come after that if total fertility rates everywhere fall below 2. So I think policymakers had been slightly myopic about next century and the century after that. Masood?
Which is, I mean, you could say policymakers are generally myopic about a whole range of things that are going to come and hit us. I mean, look, the other big example where myopia has reigned supreme is, of course, climate change. But if you think about climate change, it's another big long-term trend that is going to have huge consequences, irreversible. Our ability to make progress on that has also been catching up now, a little too late to try and affect outcome. So I agree with that. I would just say one sort of slightly discordant thing to what you've said. Even as we recognize that there is this huge problem now, or there is a huge trend of declining fertility, which could become a huge problem if it continues in many parts of the world, I think we have to recognize there are still countries where women are having 4, 5, 6, 7 children. And they're doing so not out of their volition, but because of lack of access to the kinds of support systems and conception advice and equipment that would enable them to make choices about their own bodies. At the end of the day, the most important thing to me personally is that women need to be the ones who are deciding for themselves about the choices that they make about when and how to start and space births in their life. And that is something that quite a few women are still denied. And that is, so I want to kind of just come back with that little codicil to the point that you raised.
We really don't have time for many more questions. I'll add just one final thought before the clock runs out. There wasn't time to get into the climate change question. When I first thought about declining population, I thought to myself, oh good, that probably solves the problem of climate change if the population goes back down to 2 billion. Unfortunately, the timing is off.
Right.
All the kind of problems of climate change, insofar as the IPCC projections are right, hit just about the time that the population approaches its peak. And that means that the migration from countries in Africa that will be affected by climate change will be on an even larger scale than if it was just economics doing the work. Well, we are out of time. I want to thank everybody who came, as well as those who've watched this on the live stream. I hope at least we've planted a couple of seeds in your minds about what lies beyond the horizon for Homo sapiens. Thanks very much and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.